Thank you, Dr. Boyle. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Beckham Lecture Series. Dr. Raymond E. Beckham is a retired faculty member and administrator here at BYU and is a professor emeritus of communications who taught advertising and public relations for 21 years. He served as director of development and public services for 5 years each, founded the Aspen Grove Family Camp, and worked for the Travel Studies Department Evening School, and started the New York City internship program in the School of Communications, which has been highly successful for the last 35 to 40 years. BYU has given a number of awards to Professor Beckham, including the Presidential Medal and the Alumni Distinguished Service Award. He's been a member of several church executive committees and has served as a bishop, stake president, mission president, temple sealer, and in a temple presidency, and as a regional representative. He married Ida Lee Jackson in 1947, and the couple has 5 children and 19 grandchildren, and a number of great-grandchildren. Following the passing of his wife, Ida Lee, in 1994, he married Jeanette Callister Hales, former president of the Church General Young Women's Program. She and her former husband, Robert H. Hales, have 5 children and 14 grandchildren. And we're grateful to the Beckhams for their establishment of this fund, and they're here with us today, and so we'd invite you to join us in giving them a round of applause. We'll now have the introduction of Dr. Hardy by Professor Kirk Larson, Associate Director of the Kennedy Center and a faculty member in the Department of History.
It's a pleasure to introduce Jeff Hardy. He is, in at least an academic sense, something of a product of BYU. He completed a BA here in International Studies, followed by a master's degree in history. But then he abandoned the mountains of Utah for the leafy streets of New Jersey, completing his PhD in history at Princeton University. But we were able to use the mountains and the possibility for rock climbing to lure him back, and have been pleased to have him in the Department of History. As indicated by the topic of his presentation today, one of his main areas of specialty is the Soviet Union, and particularly the Soviet prison system. He has written and researched and published extensively on various aspects of this, including a forthcoming book from Cornell University Press entitled The Gulag After Stalin, Redefining Punishment in Khrushchev's Soviet Union, 1953 to 64. An expert in the Soviet Union and its penal systems and systems of punishment and control more generally. It's been really fun to have conversations with Jeff as we compare our favorite totalitarian systems, in my case North Korea, in his case the Soviet system. But also, if you look at some of the research he's done and presented on, one interesting thing jumped out to me. You maybe want to hold off before you finalize your next big family trip to Cancun or Paris, because there apparently is a thing, or was a thing, called Gulag tourism. And so you might want to sort of check that out before you push that button on Travelocity. In addition to interests in totalitarian dictatorships, Jeff is also an avid rock climber, biker. He likes golf, chess, birding, and even fantasy football. So I give you a valued and esteemed colleague, Jeff Hardy.
Okay, thank you, Kirk, for that kind introduction. Thank you to the School of Communications, and especially to Dr. Beckham for this really fine lecture series. I've been a participant as an audience member before, and it is now a pleasure to stand before you to deliver this lecture. So I'd like to begin by imagining a prisoner. Let's see. Here we go. We'll call him Ivan Ivanovich. A prisoner in the Soviet Union in the mid-1930s, perhaps 1936, we could say, the same year that Stalin's new constitution was passed, the most democratic constitution in the world, according to its author. Perhaps Ivan Ivanovich is serving time for petty theft, perhaps for something more interesting, say for participating in a Trotskyite conspiracy. He is a few months into his sentence. In fact, he just completed a weeks-long voyage by train from Moscow, stopping at various transit prisons along the way. And he finds himself down here in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, in Karaganda, the Karaganda Corrective Labor Camp, or Karlag for short. He begins to adjust to his new life. He is assigned a bunk in the communal barracks, a labor brigade. He begins to make friends with fellow inmates. And after a week or so, he finally has a chance to visit the camp library, because there is a camp library, just like there is a camp library in the prisons of Moscow where he previously served time. So he asked a librarian, a fellow prisoner, for something to read, and he's given a newspaper produced by the camp itself, and the newspaper is called Putyovka, and you can see it here. Instinctively, he turns to the back page of the newspaper, and his eyes are drawn immediately to a picture in the middle of the page, a picture of Lenin, of Stalin, of a collective farm, of a factory. No, although he may have found any of those things. Rather, he found a picture of a pelican. A pelican that, according to the caption, had been shot at a nearby lake, stuffed, and placed in the Gulag Museum in the administrative complex. So here we have, in a place where you might not expect it, a newspaper, and in that newspaper, of all things, a pelican, which itself is in a museum in a prison camp. Now, we might think that Stalin was a murderous tyrant. Okay, he was. Okay, he was. But if that's all we think of him and of the Soviet Union, we're missing a lot of really interesting stories. And the story I want to share with you today is this story about the Gulag and the newspaper and the pelican. So I'd like to start by first introducing the Gulag, then I'll delve into the newspapers themselves, and then into some specific topics that were in the newspaper. So what was the Gulag? Quite simply, the Gulag was the Soviet Union's system of judicial incarceration. If people break the law in the United States, they're sent to a penitentiary in a state or federal system. If they break the law in the Soviet Union and are sentenced to deprivation of liberty, they're typically sent to a corrective labor camp or corrective labor colony. And these camps and colonies belonged administratively to the Gulag, which is an acronym for Main Administration of Camps. So the Gulag is an administrative structure. Most inmates live in communal barracks rather than cells. They're confined by wood and barbed wire fences rather than brick walls, and they labor together usually outside of the actual camp while under armed guard. You can see a blueprint of a typical camp here with the barbed wire perimeter fence. You've got a number of barracks along with various other buildings. There's a club, a library, a cafeteria, a kitchen, various guard and administrative buildings out here. And then the prisoners would go off and labor, in this case, on the road next to the camp. All right, the Gulag was large. In the early 1920s, or in the 20s and early 1930s, you have a few 100,000 inmates. That number then climbs rapidly during the 1930s. And by the early 50s, when the system really peaks, we're at about 2.5 million inmates. This is a large number in a country of some 180 million inmates. Indeed, the Soviets imprisoned more than any other country at the time, both in absolute and relative terms, although it was surpassed in both metrics in the late 1980s by the United States, which continues to hold that distinction today. Annual mortality rate in the Gulag fluctuates widely, as you can see. For the most part, hovering around 5% in the 1930s, with the exception of a famine year in 33. The war years of 42 are especially deadly, 42, 43, and then going to under 1% in the 1950s. For the most part, these deaths are not intended. The Gulag was not the functional equivalent of the Nazi death camps. It's certainly true that Stalin and the Bolsheviks were waging what they called class warfare in their country, and the overriding concern was not to minimize the number of people who died in this struggle to build socialism. The end certainly justified the means in this Soviet quest. But in the Gulag, the standing order was not to kill inmates, but to use them in construction and other work-related projects, and also to rehabilitate them. Excess mortality, in fact, got Gulag commanders fired. It was something to be avoided. So prisoners, it turned out, were valued. They were valued certainly as laborers. But prisoners were also, at least on paper, valued as citizens, as fathers, as sons, and as comrades. wayward comrades, perhaps, but comrades nonetheless, comrades to rehabilitate. So what does this mean, rehabilitation in the Soviet context? At the outset, I should note that we're talking about rehabilitation in its ideal form, not in the actual reality of how this played out on the ground. In the Soviet Union, pretty much anywhere else, rehabilitation is very difficult. So I'm looking at what they're trying to accomplish here. The basic idea is to transform criminals, class enemies, and ideological enemies into socially useful people, honest Soviet citizens. And they use terms like correction and re-education and the more industrial reforging when they're talking about this process. This is the language that they use. And we see this rehabilitative mission all over the Gulag, in how the Gulag is organized, in the types of activities that they promote for prisoners. I mean, there's theater troupes, there's brass bands, there's reading circles, other cultural events. You've got sporting competitions. And then you've got the newspapers. So we'll turn to the newspapers here. But I should also say that all of this effort, all of this propaganda and rehabilitation, it's for the prisoners, but it's also for the low-level guards and administrators as well, most of whom were young and poorly educated. Many were fresh army conscripts. Others were former convicts themselves. And so the Gulag is supposed to teach the value of socialism to prisoners and to guards alike. Okay, so among these varied methods of turning criminals into honest socialist citizens, mass communications plays an important role. Films brought didactic entertainment into the camps. Radios allowed camp commanders to instruct prisoners remotely. Visual propaganda adorned the walls of barracks and production facilities, as we can see in this picture of a Gulag barrack here. And the most ubiquitous form of mass communications in the Gulag was the newspaper. Produced by and consumed by both inmates and administrators, Gulag newspapers, like their counterparts on the other side of the barbed wire, were designed to inform, to entertain, and of course to re-educate. To the researcher today, they provide a very fascinating, if heavily tainted, window into the world of repression and propaganda in this totalitarian context. Stamped at the top here, not for distribution outside of the camp. Their audience was literally captive. Gulag newspapers demonstrate how Soviet authorities envisioned and articulated the re-educational process and how they prioritized the various means of effecting re-education. So in the time that remains, I want to explore three themes that we find in these newspapers. Not the only themes, but three themes that I find interesting and important: labor, religion, and science. So we start with labor. The Soviet Union was, at its root, an economic experiment. This is what socialism is fundamentally about: rearranging the economic structure in order to create a more equitable and ultimately a more productive society, which would in turn ensure greater human happiness. This is the dream of Marx and of Lenin and of Stalin. In practical terms, this means abolishing private property in favor of state control of the economy. It means, at least by the late 1920s, a push for rapid industrialization. And it means trying to find a way to make labor under socialism more rewarding and productive than labor under capitalism. We see these themes running through many of the major policy debates of top Bolsheviks in the 1920s. And by the 1930s, promoting this economic restructuring dominated Soviet life, including mass communications. In Gulag newspapers, we see some focus on labor and industry and production already in the early to mid-1920s, when the Gulag system was first being established. At this point, though, they certainly do not take center stage. They're just one of many subjects being discussed, along with international affairs and culture, the development of political awareness, and a bunch of other themes. This is illustrated clearly here in the December 13th, 1925 edition of the newspaper Novaya Solovki. This was a newspaper published by and for inmates in the Solovki camp complex of the far north. And we see here the production updates here taking place on page 3. You can learn about factories being built, the progress of ship repairs, the work of the local collective farm. It's pretty dry reporting, and it's buried on page 3 here. This is emblematic of the 1920s. In the 1930s, though, labor moves from being just one of the many different things to report on in the Gulag newspapers to being almost the only content of Gulag newspapers. No longer third-page news, it occupied just about every page, and almost always the first page. Labor competitions are reported on. Prisoners are labeled shock workers and put armeici, a neologism that casts inmates as heroic soldiers engaged in the construction of transportation infrastructure. Labor competitions between brigades were reported on. Daily, monthly, and yearly plan fulfillment was highlighted. Attention is paid to cost reduction, quality control. Labor is glorified, often in very militant language. Industrialization was, after all, in large part done to prepare with war for the West, specifically with Hitler's Germany. And consistent with this, there's lots of attacks on the lazy, those who don't fulfill their production norms. And they are named by name, they are shamed, they're called class enemies and other epithets. Sometimes all of this educational or economic language is couched in the language of re-education, but often it's about the strength and the power of the Soviet state, this shining beacon of socialism. A typical newspaper article title from this era is shown here from the Gulag newspaper Lumberjack. Let's see, still on this one. Lumberjack, Lesorub. The lead title reads, "The third 10-day period in October must be a turning point in fulfilling the fourth quarter plan." How about that for some nice socialist language? We've got one here from the newspaper of the Ukht Pechorny camp. 600 nuts in a shift. It's a new record by inmate Nechayev, smashing the old record of 306 nuts held by inmate Kozlov. And the new record holder, according to the brief article, promises to produce even more bolts and of even better quality, which will reduce their production costs. So it's exciting stuff, right? I mean, the goal here is to try to amp up the prisoners, to get them to smash these old production records and move forward the effort of socialist construction. And we can see a bunch more examples of this, right? Use combines to their maximum capacity. The great achievements of combine drivers. Goncharov's brigade fulfilled 236% of the plan. We're challenging Agricultural Collective Number 2 to a labor competition. These are the titles of the newspapers that Gulag inmates are reading in the 1930s. I could really spend a lot of time on this because labor and production are so central to Soviet ideology, to their conceptions of identity, and to the Gulag mission of re-education. As a rough estimate, some 80% of Gulag articles in the 1930s in these newspapers are devoted to production and labor. So this is the really big story here. But it's not the only story. And in the time remaining, I'd like to talk about two other themes that are found much more sporadically in the Gulag press: science and religion. With issues of faith and reason so central to the mission of Brigham Young University, I thought that you might be more interested in this than in labor and production. Okay, so let's move on to religion directly then. The Soviet Union, of course, is fairly hostile to religion. Marx had famously called religion the opiate of the people. And the USSR worked to diminish, if not eliminate, the role of religion in society. So most churches were closed or demolished, including the great Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow. Priests are imprisoned or executed. Church holidays were replaced by secular ones. The Hajj to Mecca was forbidden. And kids were taught the evils of religion and brought up on socialism instead. Naturally, given the mission of Gulag newspapers to re-educate, to reform the hearts and minds of wayward citizens, one would expect to find a healthy dose of anti-religious propaganda. And in fact, in the 1920s, you do find this, particularly at the corrective labor camp at Solovki. And there are good reasons for this. The articles of this era, the 1920s, came before the industrialization drive of the 1930s, sucked the creative air out of editorial rooms across the Soviet Union. These articles were produced largely by leftist political prisoners, that is, prisoners who were already convinced atheists. And they were written and read at Solovki, which, as many of you probably know, is one of the great monastic complexes of Russian Orthodoxy. Religious imagery and architecture, in other words, literally surrounded them. So for the editors of Novaya Solovki, the camp newspaper, and Slon, the camp literary journal, religion was a clear and present danger that needed to be addressed. And not surprisingly, a number of articles take their context directly from this religious environment. The poem To a Monk talks about religious deception and encourages the monk to leave that behind and join the working class. Another, called The Dust of the Centuries, reported on the historical value of ancient religious manuscripts found at the monastery, all while mocking the actual religious content of those manuscripts. Another theme found in Solovki mass communications is the attack on religious holidays, Easter and Christmas, the most prominent dates in the Orthodox calendar. Novaya Solovki reported in 1925 that the local Communist Youth League had done a poor job conducting anti-religious activities on Christmas. This is noted again the following year, with the language of this article suggesting that this year must be different. And it's interesting here. The article explains that experience has shown that blaspheming does not weaken but rather strengthens religion. Isn't that interesting? So instead of making fun of religion, serious discussions should be held to persuade that God is a human invention. All right, so mockery doesn't work is the suggestion that's being made here. We find similar themes in this article entitled Easter. In addition to these articles and poems, we have a few illustrations found in Novaya Solovki and Sloan that carry an anti-religious message. A humorous example of this is located here in the July 24 edition of Sloan. The title is Caricatures of Faith, and depicted below are two drawings labeled Pilgrimage to Solovki, Then and Now. And with the same background of the famous monastery complex, we see on top 4 peasants in search of spiritual enlightenment or healing. On bottom, however, we are presented with several well-dressed men and women being led to Solovki by Red Army soldiers, presumably to the labor camp. These class enemies of the new socialist regime, the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, were certainly not making a voluntary pilgrimage to Solovki. But the idea here is that they too will receive light, knowledge, and healing, albeit of a socialist sort. I should mention that this picture probably wouldn't have passed the censor just a few years later. This is still in the 1920s when we have an outburst of creative activity. A second caricature from the journal Sloan from 1924 shows another before and after juxtaposition. Labeled The Patrons of Solovki, we have God on the left, before, and on the right we see what must be the Solovki camp commander, astride an elephant, tattooed with a hammer and a sickle. I should note at this point that the acronym for the camp, which the literary journal adopted, Sloan, also happens to be the Russian word for elephant, hence the elephant here. Quite clearly, we see that the power of God on Solovki had been replaced by the power of the new socialist regime. A third set of pictures from 1925 from Novaya Solovki puts satire aside and really illustrates what the Soviets were trying to accomplish. They're labeled the Citadel, or the Solovki Citadel and Dock, with the first drawing showing 1923 up here on the top, and you see very prominently the monastic complex. 1925, the complex has receded into the background, and in the foreground we see what the Soviet regime is building: docks, steamships, economic activity. So religion as receding and as obscured by production. The remnants of the old way of life are not yet eliminated, but they are being eliminated, is the message here. And the accompanying poem that goes along with this that you see on the slide, Labor Has Conquered, makes the same point, telling that the reader that we have come far and we will go farther still from the prior way of life. Now, moving to the 1930s, anti-religious propaganda in Gulag newspapers becomes much sparser. This is largely due to the overwhelming tide of production-related content, but to some extent this is up to the individual editors. Some Gulag newspapers in the 1930s have absolutely no anti-religious content for years at a time. Others, though, we do find some, although it tends to be limited to about 3 to 4 articles per year. So again, up to the individual editors. So then in those few newspapers that did occasionally publish anti-religious content, what do we find? Some things are quite similar to the 1920s. We certainly find a few poems with anti-religious content. We find anti-religious activities surrounding holidays that was still being reported on, as in this slide about Christmas and the Camp Gulag. We do have some visual propaganda in the newspapers, although not a whole lot of it. This picture we see has no caption, but it's similar to the last one that we looked at in that we have a Russian Orthodox cathedral very much in the background of this picture, and in the foreground some sort of construction activity taking place that will eventually obscure it, it looks like. In another illustration from the newspaper Lumberjack, the reader is presented with a so-called cemetery of loafers. We see 3 graves along with a vulture, symbolizing that loafers, or lazy people, will in fact perish. In the Gulag in the 1930s, productivity is often tied to rations. So if you don't meet your quotas, you're not fed as much. So this goes back to the theme of production and labor, but it's also unmistakable that the crosses are Christian. In fact, Orthodox in nature. Clearly the implication is that those who retain their old ways, their religiosity, will be prone to laziness. They will not adopt the new work ethic of socialist demands, and as communists, we will not mourn their deaths, right? We will not mourn their deaths. In other ways, though, there's a definite shift in the anti-religious articles of the 1930s. For one thing, as the Soviet Union increased its state capacity in the southern borderlands, we see the inclusion of propaganda targeting Islam. So not only do we have articles about Easter and Christmas, we find articles attacking Ramadan, for example, which here is incorrectly called Uraza. Ramadan is presented as just another tool in the oppression of the working class. Ethnic minorities in the Gulag are called on to not fast, but rather to work hard. After all, the article makes clear workers should be free from all religious ways. They should not consider themselves slave of a non-existent God. And we see this in a number of other articles from the same time. We've got a poem provocatively titled Repentance at the Demit Lag camp that tells the story of a lazy highway robber, Muhammad Ali. And the climax of this fairly lengthy poem, which eventually ends with a glorification of labor, of course, is the line, "Curse you, omnipotent God, you too are an unworthy highway bandit. In my soul you have sown vice. You are unworthy to wash my feet. Curse you, omnipotent God." This is really strong stuff. Soviet poetry is not subtle, right? And we definitely get a sense of that here. It doesn't get much less subtle than this. And in fact, this is fairly typical of anti-religious propaganda in Gulag newspapers in the 1930s. It's much more forceful, much more direct, and it's also, in many cases, very personal. And we see this in fiction, but we also see this in nonfiction or apparent nonfiction. Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference in these newspapers. So, for example, we find a letter addressed to the deputy camp commander of the Temlog camp, pictured here, ostensibly from a prisoner. I can't verify that this was actually written by a prisoner, but this at least is what other inmates are reading. And this is what the letter says. "Since the time I have been in the camp, I have rethought my previous convictions and have come to the conclusion that, as a sectarian, I had deeply erred, and by this I had brought great harm to socialist construction. Every religious organization, in essence, is counter-revolutionary, as they dull the class consciousness of the workers and prevent them from fulfilling revolutionary tasks. Now new prospects of a new real life have been unfolded, and I want to fight in the ranks of the working class for the realization of socialism and cut off all ties to sectarianism." Signed, Prisoner V. Lebedev. Okay, and we've got an explanation from a newspaper editor below on how prisoners should properly interpret this letter. And he says that this is an example of the blind now seeing. Really interesting that he uses a Christian metaphor here to discredit Christianity, to discredit religion. Okay, so there's other examples of this, but the point here is that this is not what we saw in the 1920s, kind of leftist intellectuals talking about how best to go about this mission of eliminating Christianity. Or rather, it's not nuanced, it's not measured, it's an in-your-face, you're with us or you're against us manifesto. It's very bold and it's very personal. Okay, a final trend that we see in anti-religious propaganda in the 1930s is the juxtaposition of religion and science. A front-page article from 1933 makes this clear with a quote from Stalin himself, which reads, "The party cannot be neutral in regard to religion. It conducts anti-religious propaganda against any and all religious ideas because the party is for science. And religious ideas go against science." Okay, so we know where Stalin stands, and we see this in other articles as well, such as Did Christ Really Exist, right? Where's the evidence for that other than the Bible? But I wanted to focus on this lesson plan on natural history, published in 1935. It instructs cultural workers in the camp to devote 2 hours to explain the origins of mankind. And I'd like to read just a bit of this to give you a flavor of the language. "Religion teaches that man was created by God. Modern science has demonstrated that mankind by natural means came about from animal predecessors, and that only through labor has man become intelligent matter." It continues further, "Religion gets in the way of and harms the creation of socialist society. Faith in God and socialism are incompatible. Here in the Soviet Union, even children do not believe in the godly origins of mankind. But not believing is not enough. One needs to know and to be able to prove." So here we have the stark contrast laid bare. Science and religion fundamentally incompatible. It's notable here that this is a lesson plan, which is published in the newspaper. Lesson plans like this typically are sent in memo form from the cultural educational department of the Gulag to individual cultural educational workers in the camps. To publish it in the newspaper, though, places the lesson plan directly in the hands of the inmates, giving them an additional opportunity to be exposed to these ideas, additional time to think about the questions posed before the actual time of discussion, and in a way it lets them place themselves in the role of cultural worker. It momentarily takes them out of prisoner garb and lets them peek behind the scenes to see what the authorities are thinking about, what they are planning, what they are trying to accomplish. At least this is the desired effect. And without doubt, these attacks on religion presented a very stark contrast of truth versus superstition, modernity versus backwardness, the new socialist way of life versus the oppression of feudalism and capitalism. Okay, so now that we've already begun to talk about it, let's get really into this theme of science. If a new Soviet person is to love labor, he's also supposed to be well educated, and not just in a vocational sense. This was a stark challenge in a largely rural country that boasted some of the lowest literacy rates in Europe. But we see Gulag commanders organizing literacy courses, setting up elementary schools, setting up libraries, holding poetry readings, organizing festivals in honor of Pushkin and other literary greats. We see special literary journals with writing produced by inmates, and so forth. So if Soviet-style socialism was to surpass Western capitalism, it was to have a broadly educated and cultured society. And we find this in Gulag newspapers, right? We find the discussion of Pushkin and Gorky. We find calls to liquidate illiteracy, as they say. And then we also find a fair amount of scientific information. The aim, in part, as already demonstrated, was to prove the natural origins of the earth and mankind, to directly attack the idea of a God-created world. But most of the scientific information presented in Gulag newspapers was not accompanied by anti-religious commentary. Okay, it's science that's standing on its own merits. Now, in terms of content, the scientific information centers on the natural world. After all, inmates are living in camps with the stars above them, with nature surrounding them. And many of these camps are in remote areas of the Soviet Union, areas that hadn't been studied before by science. Moreover, kind of this natural history is fairly easy to understand, science light, we might say. Why write about cellular biology or chemistry or physics when we can start with what the inmates can actually see and touch and feel? And another reason to focus on the natural world, it held productive value. So science in opposition to religion, science in the service of production, and science for its own intellectual merits. We find all three in the Gulag newspapers when we do come across science at all. We see this in the mid-1920s at Solovki. The first article that I share with you here talks about the creation of a local nature preserve, an animal preserve, a zoo essentially, where local wildlife could be concentrated and then studied. This is approved by camp leadership, and it gives the prisoners an opportunity to go visit the zoo. I mean, think about that. They're in the Gulag, and they're visiting the zoo. And you got rabbits and squirrels and ducks, loons, Arctic hares, even an eagle that are being fed and cared for by inmates. We also read about nature outside of the animal preserve. There's reports on the climate of Solovki and its effect on the local flora and fauna. There's articles like this, Toward the Study of the Nature of the Solovetsky Islands, implying that conclusions were still tentative, still awaiting further study. You see here a red-footed falcon and a white-tailed eagle that are found on the islands. Indeed, other articles soon followed that reported on efforts to study nature and climate in the region. And inmates themselves are actually asked, you see here a list of questions on the right, to report to the local nature study group, because there's a nature study group in the camp, a series of questions about snowfall and temperature and sea ice and bird migration and the appearance of flowers and mosquitoes in the springtime. So we see an emphasis here not just on the dissemination of scientific information. We see an emphasis on the creation of scientific information. Prisoners and guards were to be scientifically literate, and what better way to accomplish this than to have them actually participate in science? We see similar themes in the 1930s, similar questions being asked, similar calls to report on local science. We see this in the newspaper Strayets Alabama in eastern Siberia. And we also see this, to return now to the Pelican, in the camp newspaper of the Karlag camp. At Karlag, perhaps more than any other camp newspaper, we see concern about the local environment. We see talk of this natural history museum that has been created. We get this detailed article about the pelican. And there's a surprising amount of scientific information here. It's a great white pelican, right? Not just any pelican. In the Russian, it's the rosy pelican. It nests, the readers are informed, in tropical regions like Africa and India. In its first year, it is gray in color, followed by white in the second year, and then pinkish in the third year. This is obviously a recent photograph, but you can see kind of the pinkish hue here on this sample. The specimen taken had a 2-meter wingspan. This is actually a typo. It should have been 3 meters, and a half-meter long bill. And we see over the following months the stream of nature articles continuing, some dealing with nature in an economic sense, other in a purely scientific, informational sense. Articles like Our Riches, which talks about archaeology. It talks about plants that can be used for industry and for medicine and forage. And it makes calls for future study, including study performed by the inmates themselves. Opposite this article is a picture of a great bustard, which the caption tells us weighs 18 kilograms or 40 pounds. The great bustard is, in fact, one of the heaviest flying animals in the world, with an average weight of 11 kilograms. So this one in the camp must have been massive, or else they exaggerated the weight, one of the two. And not only was it huge, it was reportedly tamed by a prisoner and kept as a sort of pet in the camp. A week later, September 28th, 1936, the newspaper announced the creation of a zoo, an animal preserve, which had been approved by the camp commander. It would be expressly for the purpose of scientific observation. A prisoner, A.S. Krukov, a local expert in flora and fauna, would care for the animals, and they targeted bird species including the great bustard, cranes, swans, ducks with the reddish shell duck meriting special mention, geese, willow ptarmigans, gray partridges, quail, black grouse, sandpipers, curlews, the Cinereous vulture, which is the world's largest bird of prey, and hawks, accipiters to be precise. And we see in the article a trained falconer, a prisoner, who is here performing his traditional craft in the camp. When it comes to the list of targeted beasts for this zoo, however, a slightly different picture emerges. For here, a secondary justification for creating the bird and animal preserve is given. The preserve would allow the camp to study, multiply, and then farm animals whose fur was valuable for winter clothing. So the ermine, the river otter, the red fox, the beaver, the hare, and the marmot are all targeted for capture and placement in the preserve. Subsequent articles follow on these same themes, which I think we'll skip in the interest of time. But we see again the focus on the creation of knowledge, the creation of science by the prisoners of the Gulag. So to return in conclusion to our prisoner Ivan Ivanovich, to me this is the story of the Gulag. This is the story of the Soviet Union. The story in its ideal form, that is. In reality, Ivan Ivanovich was, who knows, maybe he was murdered by a fellow prisoner, maybe he was shot by a guard while trying to escape, maybe he died from malnutrition and disease during the war years. Statistically speaking, actually he was probably released and returned to society. But whatever his ultimate fate, the Soviet Union thought that he, this thief, this rapist, this political prisoner, whoever he was, should read newspapers to learn about the evils of religion, to learn about the migration patterns of the birds of Central Asia, all while performing hard labor to atone for his crimes. He was supposed to return to society a better man, a work-loving man, a more educated and less superstitious man, a new Soviet man. And we see this ideal manifested all over the place, in the classroom, in the factory, in the army, and in the Gulag, and in every form of mass communication, film, radio, newspaper, and so forth. And it's my view that it is worth studying these ideals and how these ideals were communicated to the Soviet people, and not simply discount all of this as disingenuous propaganda. Thank you for your time and attention. So at this point, we do have time for questions. If you have any, go ahead and just raise your hand and try to speak loudly so everyone can hear. Yes, go ahead.
How long were the sentences usually?
That's a great question. In the 1930s, we see sentence lengths being lengthened considerably. And so your standard term is going to range from 5 to 15 years, although we do get some terms that are longer. For political prisoners, they're going to be at the upper end of that range, 10 to 20 years, depending on when they're arrested. Yeah, if they're not shot, right? Yeah.
One of the slides said that the duty of every 35er is to do better than that. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, the 35er, glad you caught on that. So in terms of motivating production, they come up with all these new terms. And so 35er, this is a term for the year 1935. And if we're going to fulfill kind of the productive goals of 1935, we're going to call ourselves 35ers and really cast ourselves as heroes of this year. That's kind of the essence of that term. Yeah. Yes?
Around how many of these corrective labor camps were in Russia?
How many corrective labor camps were in Russia? I showed you the slide at the beginning that shows the corrective labor camps. They're basically all over. It kind of depends on how you categorize them, but we are talking about hundreds. Hundreds of these, yeah. The biggest ones are located kind of up here in the far north, out here in the far northeast, where I was talking about down here in Karaganda, and then also here in the Urals. Those are kind of the biggest of the camps. Yeah?
What's like the percentage of the literacy within these gulags? Since I thought that you said that Russia was one of the most illiterate, and then a lot of the newspapers are generally pretty text heavy. So I was
Right.
surprised they would be. So I know that we're getting tons of different kinds of people here,
A great question about literacy rates in the camps. So they actually track these statistics, and we see literacy rates rising as the years go by, similar to Soviet society generally. In the 1930s, 20s and 30s, basically what happens is they produce the newspapers and then they have readings of the newspapers in the work brigades and the barracks. So even if you can't actually read it, you're still exposed to the content. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So it seems like in these newspapers there was a lot of participation from the prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
Like they get to write and actually help with publication. Is it true that they were able to do that not with just newspapers but with like literary journals and publications of books and novels and things like that?
Good. So a question about how involved the prisoners are in these newspapers and other cultural activities. And the answer is, yeah, they're very involved. That this is seen as a way to re-educate them, and it's also seen by the administrators as a way to overcome the traditional rift between guards and inmates, right? If the inmates are doing this themselves, then perhaps it will be better received by their fellow inmates. And so we see inmates involved not just in cultural productions like this, we see them acquiring a range of administrative functions in the camps, including in some times in places where they're actually guarding, including with loaded weapons. So the inmates are very much integrated into the administrative structures of the Gulag, which is kind of a fascinating story. Yeah. And a lot of them are political prisoners, so they have the expertise needed to write in the newspapers and to be editors. The cultural elite of the Soviet Union in the 1930s is sent to the Gulag, and we find many of them participating in these activities. Yeah?
So if some of the political prisoners are guards and have weapons, why don't they just free everyone and get out?
Well, they're very selective in who they choose to be these inmate guards. Yes, Kurt?
In the scientific reporting, did any of the pseudoscience that was popular in the day, like Lysenko's vernalization, that stuff, make it into these newspapers?
Great question. Does Soviet pseudoscience make it into the newspapers? Lysenko comes a bit later, and I haven't yet gotten into the newspapers of the 40s and then into the 50s. I'll be going to Moscow in the springtime to try to track some of these down. But basically, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're reporting Soviet science, and Lysenko, of course, is influential in agriculture at Karaganda and many other camps. Agriculture is one of the main productive activities for prisoners. So my hunch is that absolutely this would have been done. Now it's interesting, someone did a recent study of Lysenko's ideas and how they affected Soviet agriculture. And it was actually found that his ideas had a positive effect on agricultural production. Not for the reasons that he thought, but that they actually kind of worked, right? If you're trying to create a good set of genes, then you're treating your animals better and you're taking better care of your crops, and that actually does increase production, even if it doesn't transmit those genes to the next generation. So, an interesting side note on Lysenko and some recent research on that. In the back, go ahead. Great question. Do prisoners writing these newspaper articles get time off work, essentially? And this varies a bit, but the answer typically is no, that this is something that they do in the evening hours, in what would be their spare time. They might get a couple of hours off of the working day, but for the most part, this is a voluntary activity that they might do for a variety of reasons, to ingratiate themselves with the administration, which could end up paying dividends in a number of different ways. They may see themselves as, fulfilling a valuable mission. A lot of inmates in the Gulag are devoted socialists. I know that may be hard to believe, but it's true. And they see it their mission to enlighten their fellow prisoners. So yeah, great question. This is typically in addition to the labor they performed. Yeah?
I'm wondering how much of the prison systems of the Soviet Union were carried over from Imperial Russia and
Also a very good question. Obviously, at first in the 1920s, there's a lot of carryover in terms of institutions and in terms of personnel, right? The guards and the administrators. The Solovki Key camp that I talked a lot about, which, by the way, is way up here on an island in the Arctic Ocean. This was kind of the first truly Soviet experiment into the camp system. So this is uniquely Soviet. And in the 1920s, they learned that this worked, and then they spread it to the rest of the Soviet Union. The camp type where hard labor is the primary occupation of the prisoners. The old Tsarist system was focused both on kind of cellular confinement that we see in the West, and then also on a system of exile that sent people to Siberia, where they typically did not live behind barbed wire or bars. They lived in settlements where they simply had to check in with the police every couple of weeks. So it was exile, we might call it, more than it was a camp-type system of incarceration. Yes?
Were they all men?
In the Gulag? No. About 80 to 90% are men, 10 to 20% are women, and that fluctuates. But those are pretty typical numbers if we look at prison systems around the world. Yes?
You talked about the anti-religious content depending on the individual editors who put in newspapers, but how much of that content was really like mockery of religion, and how much was it to educate them to disregard religion and support socialism?
Yeah, we definitely find both in the 1920s. The 1930s comes out more strongly on the side of mockery, I guess, and really taking a strident stance against religion. So the attack on religion is multi-pronged in the Gulag and in the Soviet Union generally. And it does vary according to time and place. It kind of ebbs and flows over the course of the Soviet Union's existence. So the 1920s is actually a period of harsh repression against religion, early 1930s as well. But then we kind of have a lapse as the 30s go on and into the 40s, and Stalin actually uses the Russian Orthodox Church in World War II to support the war effort. So, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it is kind of both. We see both things happening, depending on the editor. And that's one interesting point that I think I made, but I'll just re-emphasize, is that we do see a lot of editorial discretion in these newspapers. We think of the Soviet Union as very hierarchical, very structured, but there is actually quite a bit of leeway in terms of what these newspapers can publish. And you see quite a bit of variety, especially in the 20s, but still in the 30s to some extent, a lot of variety in the content of these articles and the mix of articles that are presented. Okay, well, I guess that about wraps it up. It's 5 till 12. Thank you again for coming. I appreciate your presence.